What I want to touch base on next is running through some examples of where and how this shows up. What are we likely to see, especially if we're working with an animal ourselves or if we're working with someone who brings the animal to us for support? We may see that fear and anxiety showing up in terms of the animal's lack of attention, whether it's lack of attention to their surroundings or lack of attention to whatever consequences we're putting in place. And know that when I say consequences, I'm not necessarily talking about aversives. I'm not talking about punitive measures necessarily. This could even be positive consequences. I tried to give the dog a food reward as an example, but he's just kind of blowing me off. His attention is elsewhere, even though he might take a treat at other times. And so we may sort of recognize this when we feel like we're having to repeat ourselves, or the animal's just not getting it, or they got it, but in a very narrow framework. They're having difficulty generalizing, or we never quite get their attention to begin with. They're so concerned about all of these things that we're seeing that hypervigilance and scanning, or that loss of selective attention. And we're seeing how that shows up within that moment or within that circumstance. We may also see fear and anxiety showing up if we're trying to give that animal some feedback. Let's say that we have a dog who has a given skill set for operant skills: sit, come, stay, down, touch, target, whatever it is. But as fear and anxiety starts to climb, the animal's proficiency level starts to drop. Now, that could be in a couple of different ways. So let's say the threat the animal is perceiving is somewhere over here. And so we've got a dog that can't quite take their eyes off of the trigger. And even though we're up here saying, watch me, or touch, or any of these other cues, the dog is like, yeah, I'll be with you in a moment. I have to make sure that this thing over here is not going to jump out from behind the wall and kill me. So we may see that interfering with their ability to really attend to their handler. And in some cases, if the threat is actually coming from the handler, either because we've used perhaps more punitive methods that were unpleasant for the animal, or maybe even we're just trying to be nice, but putting too much social pressure on that dog, and the dog is giving us all of the disengaging body language cue to try to appease or try to diffuse that threat. So we may either be seeing a dog who can't attend because their focus is elsewhere, or they're actively avoiding because of the threat that they're perceiving. Both can happen. We've touched base a little bit on this one already, but if we have an animal that is experiencing fear or anxiety or stress, and that limbic system is really driving the bus, and their brain is saying basically, I'm not really looking for dinner right now. Now is not the time to play ball. What really needs to happen right now is I need to get back to safety. And so anything that we're trying to do from a reinforcement, appetitive, reward standpoint is just not on that animal's radar. And this is especially important if we have an animal where the owner might tell us, well, ordinarily they take food just fine, or this dog lives for the ball, and then we put them in a different circumstance and the ball holds no interest. That often tells us that there is a level of fear or anxiety or stress that's there that's interfering. So again, we're not talking necessarily about the what do you do next piece. We'll get to that in just a couple of slides. But first is just recognizing these are the times where our brain should say, is it possible that this is an animal that's experiencing a level of fear, anxiety, or stress that's greater than what's ideal, if we're thinking about what we're trying to teach or what we want this animal to learn. And then the last things that we'll talk about here before we start moving on to strategies and recommendations is at the top of the slide, you see more of a hyperarousal or agitation. So again, this may show up in a lot of different ways. We've talked a bit about some of the focus interruptions that may show up in a variety of circumstances. And then we've also talked a bit more about the food. But what I really want to stress here is that if we have an animal that's in a hyper-aroused, agitated state, it may even interfere with our ability to use food or ball play or toys or tugging in a safe manner if the animal is not regulating their behavioral responses very accurately. So we have an animal that becomes a bit more, let's say, shark-mouthed as they're taking food, and we're getting more teeth pressure we're losing the softness or the delicate nature in the way that that animal may take food. My own dog, Cornelius, who's resting in the other room right now, he may make an appearance at some point on the webinar, we'll see. For him, that's a huge measure for him. If his arousal level is starting to climb, one of the fastest ways for me to look at that is not only his body language, but to give him a food reward direct to mouth and just say, how much teeth do I feel? And that's a measure of his arousal. I can use that as a barometer. If I then reset the circumstance and he's now taking food more gently, not because I said gentle, but because he's actually taking it more gently, I've now moved that threshold. We're now at a different place of arousal, and that has an impact. The last one here we may see in terms of where this shows up is an animal that not just talking about, let's say, avoiding eye contact or not able to take direction because their attention is elsewhere, but an animal who has learned based on past experience that their behavior doesn't really matter. Basically, they don't know how to predict what's going to happen. They don't really have any significant control over what happens next. And we see more avoidance behaviors, and this might appear as more of a learned helplessness or an animal who's essentially shut down and disengaged. Now, I do want to stress that when we talk about, training methods, it's often the case where we talk more about fallout in terms of the, let's say, more punitive methods, those that involve some degree of aversive usage. So this might be certain tools or more of a corrective style of training. We can see these same outcomes, perhaps not as commonly, but we can see them even from a reinforcement-based method. Again, social pressure, putting food in the face for a dog who's already stressed can be aversive, and we can see this same degree of shutdown. So I really try to be respectful to the learner in front of me, and I try to be really curious about where do we think this is coming from? What can we tell? What can we learn? How can we set this animal up to learn differently?